To see you. How are you this afternoon?
Great, Barrick. How are you doing?
Good, thanks. And for those who don't know, Tim is now officially with us in our home sprint. So I appreciate your willingness to do that, Tim. I'll tell you what, it's 3:02. I'm going to go ahead and dive us into the conversation. As you all are accustomed to, I will go through the administrative items up front. This is Barrick Abramson with Confluence, and this is the September 18th meeting of the Housing Committee of the 1296 Task Force on the Rights of Coloradans with Disabilities. Members, we are excited to have you here. As usual, I would ask that you have your cameras on if you're in a place where it is safe and comfortable to do so. Members of the public, and no, I'm not just talking to my imaginary friends. We may have some folks while this is streaming over on YouTube or other apps. If you're a member of the public and you get over here onto the Zoom, we'll ask you to leave your camera off until public comment time. And if you would like to speak during public comment, I'll ask you to drop a note in the chat to Carrie Steele or to myself. And then on the note of that chat, we do ask everybody to refrain from using it outside of those exceptions. It can be distracting for all conversations, and particularly for those using a screen reader. Finally, members, as we go into the conversation, I'll ask that the first time you speak, you introduce yourself by full name, and thereafter that you at least introduce yourself by first name so folks know who is speaking, whether on this call or they're watching the video or listening to the audio of it later. With that said, here's the good news and the mixed bag of news. You guys have made such amazing progress, and we've gotten through the bulk of our work that my expectation is today's call will end up on the shorter side. I say good news and mixed news because that means I'm going to ask for some of that extra time come October. I want to kind of go over where we are with things and what to expect in the next couple of months. Today's meeting, we're going to recap most of the ideas to date. We're not here to rehash or relitigate. And just to remind people, we're being very intentional about describing these as ideas because they're not yet recommendations. These are ideas that you all have discussed and that we're going to share with the public to get some feedback from everybody, from those with lived experience to people in government, people in the private sector, and everyone across Colorado. With all of that feedback on all of your ideas, next month's meeting is really going to be a pretty intense work session to digest whatever feedback we've gotten from the public and use that to figure out how, if at all, we want to revise the ideas, shape them into recommendations, and what makes that list of recommendations you all want to include in the report. In terms of the stakeholder feedback, our approach is going to be this. We got guidance from the executive committee that having 4 different committees all rolling out anywhere from 10 to 30 ideas at different times was a little overwhelming to ask the public to digest that way. So what we've done is we've slowed down the pace of doing the outreach. We're working with the team at Dora right now to develop 2-pagers that really highlight and summarize the ideas from each committee. We'll put all of those together for everybody to distribute. We'll post them online. They will also link to the more detailed versions of all of those ideas online. But what we wanted to do is leverage all of the committee's outreach to get input on all of the different committees' ideas. Our intention is to have that done over the next week so that we can spend the next 3.5 weeks getting public input. The hope is that by rolling it out at once, it becomes more digestible in those forms, and that we create some sense of urgency by saying we have 20 days to get your input and members of the public, and then we'll bring it back to all of you. So that's the plan. I'll talk about the meeting plan for today in just a minute, but I want to take a breath and see if anyone has any questions about where we're going with the stakeholder input first. I'm seeing shaking of the head, so I'm going to keep rolling. You guys know my type A kicks in, so if any time you want me to shut up so we can talk, just raise your hands or come off mute. I want to talk just a minute about what we anticipate the report being that comes from this committee and goes up to the executive committee. We don't want you to feel like you have to get all of the perfect legislative language or what the fiscal implications and budget costs are going to be. What we're going to do is generally structure the report as this. For each idea or group of ideas, we'll name what the problem is that we're working to solve. So in our case, it may be about there is a lack of information, or contracts and advertisements are difficult to navigate and understand, or there aren't places to go to find, but we'll name the problem we're working to solve. We will name what the North Star is, what the ultimate end solution and end state is that you envision. If and only if you all believe that there may be a timeline or a gradual approach to getting there. And to be clear, when I say gradual, I'm not talking 10 and 20 years like the ADA. I'm talking if you look at something and say, hey, realistically, that may take a few years. So if we're in a case where it's going to take a transition period, in the report, we'll want to name what that North Star is and what the immediate first step as a minimum is that you'd like to see taken and recommended by the executive committee. So that's how we'll approach it. It will identify the problem we're working to solve, what the end state is we want to get to, and if there is a need for a transition to that, what the immediate and first steps should be. Certainly, we're welcome to name. This may come with some fiscal costs, but we don't want this group to get bogged down in trying to figure out what all of that is. Now, that said, I think we all know what the state of the state's budget is right now. If we make recommendations that have big fiscal asks, they're going to face an uphill battle. So we may want to include, when we're talking about those first steps, that if funds are available, A should be the immediate steps, and if funds are limited, B should be. And I'm just putting that out there so that we don't put together ideas that simply get shot down because of budget limitations, but rather we say, even with those budget limitations, there are things that are going to get done. So that's how we'll approach the ideas. Any questions on any of that? Okay. So the plan for today is really going to be two things. Our last set of conversations, we generated some ideas around permitting, around oversight, and public awareness. We did drafting during and after that, so we haven't workshopped them as a group. So I'm going to read those out for us to see if everyone's comfortable with the way they're written right now, and if we want to tighten them up. We are at the point where I think it would be a real challenge for us to come up with 10 new ideas around anything, because we just don't have time to workshop them as thoroughly. That said, I want to underscore two things. There is nothing that prevents you from, when you're hearing the public feedback, saying, we didn't get a chance to talk about X, and based on the public feedback, we think we want to add this additional idea. I'm also going to spend some time with you today identifying topics that just by virtue of the time we didn't have, and that is to say, we weren't meeting weekly. What are topics that you want to make sure the state continues to investigate, to research? I know we've named some things earlier, like the state needs to do certain things on data, but if there are topics that throughout today's conversation, it occurs to you, we just didn't get a chance to get into, I want to be able to capture those and name those in our report. So we're calling out that they were identified and need some further work, whether that's by the future CDO office or by a future work group like this. So if nobody has any questions, I'm going to take a quick drink and a quick breath and then start reading the ideas we generated at our last meeting. I see no questions, so I will go in and I'll read these one at a time and then pause for discussion, reactions, or suggestions around these. Again, our last discussion was ideas relating to permitting, oversight, and public awareness as levers for increasing inventory. The first one was direct all appropriate state agencies to examine opportunities to expand requirements or incentives for and general awareness of universal design principles. Does this capture? Do people have reactions on that? Any thoughts? Paul, please.
Paul Brady, Gun Civic Architects. I guess I struggle with universal design principles because it's really broad. I wouldn't know what to do for a client if they asked me to do that fully.
No, I appreciate that. And I'm going to bring Tim in. As I recall, this came from this big topic discussion, and to your point, maybe it's a little too high level of let's make sure that universal design is the guiding approach. Tim, your thoughts?
Hey, Tim Dolan. Well, to Paul's point, I was just going to say that if instead of universal design, or maybe make it something universal design, to include, some people call it trauma-informed design. Universal design is kind of a term of art, so I would make sure you're capturing what different people think of in terms of different, I think all the, a lot of the principles are the same, but sometimes they just come with different names.
Appreciate that. Let me do some work on that and I'll share it back out. Do other folks have thoughts of wording when we talk about to include? Are there specifics you'd want to mention? Rochelle.
Hi, Rochelle Mitchell. I would just ask Paul, do you have any suggestions of what might be something that would capture or give direction to someone a little bit better?
Oh gosh. I think I'd probably default to some of the defined ones like the type A, type B, and type C mobility, accessible units, units with communication features. As far as like trauma-informed design and some of those, I don't know standards to attach to those user types.
So if it's okay with the group, is Paul, we've actually, based on your input in the past, we've got another idea that cites those different type A, type B, the communication and others. Let me work on those over the next 24 hours and circulate this idea back around to folks.
Eric, didn't raise my hand. Go ahead, Paul.
I was just going to say, maybe suggest even a catch-all term at the end, other populations or other groups not listed herein type thing.
Yeah, Shelley, jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to say, when I think, in affordable housing, we do, to Tim's comment, we do utilize the trauma-informed design that's a known term or reference when we think about development and design. Like trauma-informed design is often used when we're looking at many of the developments, which would include accessibility as well. So I would just suggest, and I bring that up because that is a term that's known in that when we think about affordable housing development versus it's something that a developer would be familiar with.
I'll find a way to incorporate that in. Thank you. Let me go to the Paul. Did you have another one, or is your hand still up?
I just had I guess, an amendment to the trauma-informed design. I'm just trying to think worst case scenario. I don't know of a point or a scorecard or a minimum requirement to achieve trauma-informed design status. I know of broad concepts. And so how many of those concepts do I have to incorporate to meet the regulation? That's just what I'm fearing.
Let me work on some language, and then I may just ping all of you by email and see if this is still an idea that, if I can get it to a place that it's something you want to bring to stakeholders. An option is for you to come back and tell me, I just don't think this one is baked enough for us to take out there. But I'll work on it and bring it back to all of you to make that decision. I think the next one may be a little more specific, although I'll let you all give me the feedback on it. It reads as follows, currently drafted. Direct CDU or another appropriate office to coordinate and oversee the development of a centralized resource for involved stakeholders, including developers of for sale and for rent properties, architects, contractors, engineers, zoning authorities, and other local oversight entities to expand awareness and utilization of all available programs, including but not limited to LIHTC, MIHA, Prop 123, CHAFA, and other funds. Let me pause there and get reactions to the idea of creating this centralized resource for all the folks involved in design and the list of funding sources that we mentioned. Tim.
Hey, it's Tim. Are sort of nonprofits and non-government agencies intentionally left out, or
That was
should
not
they?
intentional. Yeah.
Okay. I wonder if they might, if various nonprofits might be beneficial.
Great point. And a question for all of you, because we kind of went back and forth about this a little bit. Currently, this says direct CDU or another appropriate office. There was some discussion about, is CDU the place that developers, for example, would know to go to, or would they think to go to DOLA, to Division of Housing, to CHAFA, or another? And as I ask that, I'm also going to probably raise this question on everything where we're suggesting CDU do another thing. I think it's very easy for us to say there's this new office in town, and here's the list of 87 things we think they should do. So I want to be thoughtful of how much we back the truck up and dump it all onto the new CDU desk. I also want to ask all of you where these stakeholders in the field would be most likely to go. So should CDU even be mentioned? Should we say an appropriate office? Or do you all want to float that it be a specific other office like CHAFA or Division of Housing? Shelley.
Well, yeah, Derek, I would say as a developer where we usually, I mean, it's going to be CHAFA or the Division of Housing. That's usually our partner that they're providing the gap financing a lot of times. And so that's where we would go to for a number of resources. I mean, CHAFA is who we're going to work with on a LIHTC application or Prop 123 or even MIHA, or any of the middle income resources. So that's usually the go-to where we'll start. But I don't, when I see CDO, CDOO, it's like right over my head, sorry. But because I haven't worked with them before and I'm in the space.
Understood. Maybe we give them a few years to become omnipresent and well known. But your point is well taken. That we should make this as easy to access as possible, which means going to where people are instead of trying to make them come somewhere new. Tim, your thoughts on that, though?
Yeah, I'm of the same mind. Theoretically, CDU would be great for this, but they're not highly recognized, at least not in the affordable housing community right now. And not in the service provision community, I don't think either. So it might be beneficial to have a more recognized agency. I would suggest that instead of Division of Housing, I would bump it up a level and say DOLA for a couple of reasons. Number one, DOLA also has the Division of Department of Division of Local Affairs, along with the Division of Housing. Yep. And then, just from a strategic standpoint, the CHAFA, to Shelley's point, would be very much involved. The legislature can't really tell CHAFA what to do, but the director of DOLA is on CHAFA's board of directors. Therefore, it's a really good synergy there in terms of making something like that work.
Makes a lot of sense to me. Other thoughts on this? Paul.
Paul Brady. So from the design side, we go to the local jurisdiction and they all publish their building codes. And so like when the state updated the model energy code or the electric code, it went eventually through that avenue.
So should we suggest then that this is housed up at DOLA, but encourage DOLA to promote it through local permitting, development, and housing authorities? Well, would that get it? Your point about going through locals?
Yeah, I like that language.
And then just, if I could just to, put a bow on that point is that DOLA, through the Division of Local Affairs, is very good at dealing with local municipalities. So there's already that ability.
Great. Okay. I will rework this one and we'll flag to you all when it's updated in here. I see a few of you are in the Google Doc. I'm going to violate my own rule by executive action. I'm going to drop the link in here in case any of you are visual learners or actors as well and would like to be looking at this with me. I know you all should have access to this. Tim, if you haven't gotten access to this folder, let us know and we'll email you the full link.
Okay.
Next idea, a little more broad, but this one reads, encourage the legislature, executive branch agencies, and oversight boards to explore opportunities to incorporate incentives to expand accessible inventory into construction defect efforts, such as right to cure and granting of first rights. This was me trying to capture what came directly from a conversation, and I apologize, I don't have in front of me who it was that floated that. But if anybody wants to weigh in on this idea of generally figuring out how we can connect to a lot of these efforts going on and that have been going on for years around construction defect to drive some increase in inventory and efforts here. Paul, jump in.
The only suggestion I'd have is maybe use it as a pilot program or not. Yeah, I don't think that's perfect wording, but something to that end.
Right.
Yeah, it's just sorry, and I'm a visual person, so it's taking me a second to catch up on all of this. Yeah, I think, you know, if we're gonna do some sort of incentive in the construction defects area, you know, it's doing it as a pilot is going to be hard, but well, construction defects in general is going to be hard. Let's just face that fact. Somebody who lived through last year. I'm trying to recall our conversation and like what those incentives would be. Do you recall like what we had talked about, or was this just a general idea?
Yeah, there was nothing specific named. I did look at my notes and it was just the question was asked, is there a way that we can get the state to connect efforts around construction defects to provide some incentives to drive this? And that's as far as it went.
If I may, I think I might have suggested it.
Okay.
And it was concepts like right to cure.
Yep.
If that's being proposed as maybe a solution to construction defect, and there's not broad acceptance to adopt that statewide, all housing types, maybe it could be used as an incentive to promote more accessible or attainable housing if it meets those qualifications.
Is there, Paul, is there language that you would want to test with stakeholders around that? And if you want to give that some thought, I'm happy to follow up offline as well.
I guess I'm seeing it like transit areas. That's people are in more broad acceptance that maybe the principles of density or lower parking ratios are applicable to those areas. Maybe people are willing to try out these concepts on a smaller percentage of the housing portfolio and housing that we want to promote even more so than others.
Okay, let me go to the next one, which gets to the nexus of state and local. And this is direct appropriate state agencies to examine the opportunities and considerations of allowing developers to opt to build subject to state code rather than local building code, if doing so would reduce the burden and bring more accessible units online in shorter timelines. And this was brought up in our last conversation as parallel to some of the things in modular housing, and the concern that there were some delays in some jurisdictions and that the state might be able to act more quickly. And that's the reason for allowing folks to opt there. Did I capture this right? For those of you in the space, and does everyone have thoughts on this? Paul, get in here.
I think the thought was that it'd be a parallel option. And so if, King Supers didn't have what you want, you could go to Target.
I will make sure that's clear that this is not an instead of. For those of you, Brian or Shelley or Tim, is this an issue that you've seen out there? Do we have sufficient language to test this idea of the parallel option for state code rather than local?
I'd be a little out of my depth on that one. This is Tim.
Yep.
Yeah.
Same here. I'm trying to wrap my head around it as well. Is there state code existing? Paul, maybe you can help me. Like, is there something that exists already that is this option?
Yes, there's a state code. So it all starts with the model codes, the International Building Code. And then the state, Denver, Littleton, they all get to adopt it with their own amendments. And they get to adopt different versions of it. So Denver has added amendments that encourage green roofs, electrification, that type of thing. The state code could incorporate amendments that meet state policy. And then a developer would have the choice then of which code do they want to follow, and they would make a internal assessment of how the codes best meet their goals, but also the timing. Denver's historically taken 6 months plus to get through the process. The state, you can get through the process much faster. And so you might go the state route, even though it has more regulations around of accessible housing as a trade-off for that faster timeline.
And again, today we're not about debating whether this is going to be a recommendation and getting to the fine details. We want to make sure that we have language or an idea that you want to share with the public, and language that you think is understandable in what we're trying to accomplish. I'll leave it open. We'll come back through all of these. I'm going to move on to the next one. It reads as follows currently. Issue an executive or legislative declaration encouraging local jurisdictions to consider trading density incentives, parking restrictions, or other zoning requirements for points on considerations for bringing more accessible units online. Who wants to weigh in? There we go. Tim, your thoughts.
This is Tim. Maybe this is a question for Paul. At this point, does that happen with other types of housing? Not necessarily accessible housing, but if it were some other type of housing that they wanted to drive production of, is this something that's already done?
Yes. Yeah. 2 examples is reduced parking ratios for affordable housing or extra height. You can generally build an extra story.
So perhaps, since that this is obviously kind of esoteric for me, but maybe it's maybe add language that says similar to, and then have an example. So that we know that that's not just something that's just kind of coming out of thin air. I didn't think it was, but I just don't know enough.
I apologize, I'm a little slow. Sometimes I'm trying to capture all the notes in here as we're talking. Brian.
Sure. And I'm looking at kind of the first few words of like, the mechanics of this, like where does this originate? Is this an executive order encouraging something? I don't know if that word, like, so while I appreciate that we're not like getting into the details too hard. I want to make sure that we find the kind of right vehicle for this, like,
Yep.
A resolution, or if there's a piece of legislation that comes from our work that, is this something in the legislative declaration of that piece of legislation? Is it something I'm just trying to think of, like, what is the appropriate vehicle? And I don't have it right now.
I think you're raising a good point. And from my notes in the conversation, this was one of those that the idea percolated and folks weren't quite ready to say, let's go require this. So it was, how can we get either the governor's office or the legislature to encourage it? Brian, I think you offer a very viable option of including this as in a in the legislative declarations at the top of a related bill. And we can certainly work on some options. Let's go to Shelley and then Paul.
Yeah, are we referring to the QAP? Because to me, when I see points, that's what that can score if you have, is that what it's, that can, you get score for density for, various areas. So I wasn't sure if that's what we're referencing when we talk about, because the QAP is it does get signed off by the governor.
Yeah, and Paul, I don't know if you recall on this or if someone else does. I don't think this was about the QAPs, Shelley, because we've got other ideas where we specifically do make float ideas around the weighting of the QAPs. I think this was more about the encouragement for local jurisdictions in their processes. Paul, do you recall?
It was, as I understand it, never intended to overlap with the QAP.
Yeah.
I think references to points is like Aurora and Westminster. They have minimum point criteria that developments need to meet in order to be approved. 50% masonry gets you 100 points, that type of thing.
Paul, your hand is up. Did you have an
Perfect.
additional thought?
Yeah, so maybe a way to incorporate Brian's comment is the state to require local jurisdictions draft an accessible housing plan. And that plan has strategies that jurisdiction incorporate to promote more attainable housing, more accessible housing. One of them could be zoning incentives. The other could be a portfolio-based approach of all development within their jurisdiction. So what I mean by that is maybe like tall 3-story townhomes around transit, kind of a middle density housing option. That's really hard to provide accessible housing because it's stairs, no elevator, all independent entries. But elevator served apartments, you can provide a lot more accessible housing. So if it's up to the jurisdiction to have a plan for a jurisdictional wide approach, they could approve non-elevator typed housing options in locations that make sense, so long as they also have an equal amount or, proportional whatever amount at other sites that have elevators or one-story living options. But it just provides more paths to compliance.
Thank you. There's a lot getting worked into this, so I'll definitely be redrafting this to share. Paul, I do want to clarify, because I'm not sure that I captured it. Is your suggestion that the state require local jurisdictions to have a plan and to include this, or direct them that if they have a plan, they should include this? And I know it's nuanced, but I want to be clear on what we're directing the state, calling on the state to direct local entities to do.
I guess just speaking from my own personal vantage, I think larger jurisdictions have more options in front of them. So I'm nervous to recommend that every jurisdiction have to figure this out or have to do a plan. But I don't have a better idea how to respond or incorporate Brian's good comment. Like, what does the state do? We're 2 degrees separated. So how do you push it downstream?
Brian, any thoughts on that? Recognizing resource limitations and the political dynamics of local control in Colorado. If we wanted to encourage that this be part of housing plans and affordable housing plans, what ideas do you have that we may want to? And again, we're talking about floating it so we can get aspirational and take the slings and arrows when county and municipal folks take a look at this.
Sure. The one place, and I know this is legislation that's already gone through, is in the housing action plans that Senate Bill 174 from this last year, requires that, that there, and I think that there's going to be, sounds like there's going to be some cleanup legislation, because that bill and House Bill 1313, like their timelines don't line up well. So there might be kind of a venue there to sort of say, one, like, consider this in your housing action plan, in that format that we talked about. But I'm thinking of, like, some of the plans that are already, that these are going to be in the works in the next several years. So.
No, I really appreciate that. I think that's the kind of engagement we can go for there. I will continue to work on that one. That one probably so far requires the most work from Paul. Go ahead.
So one other option might be the accessible housing bill that goes forth might have a sentence that says all projects need to provide 12% accessible housing, or local jurisdictions can incorporate a menu of options, whether it's a portfolio solution or zoning incentives, et cetera, that have a similar effect.
Paul, can I just ask a question? When we put a percentage, and maybe 12% isn't the percent, but what's the required amount? I mean, what are we basing it on? What's the baseline today? And is this driving us to more? I mean, by putting a percentage, does it move us to the point where we'll see more production in that with accessible units?
So I referenced 12% because I think that's what the census was showing and what Representative Ortiz has mentioned. The percentage varies based on the housing type you're constructing. Single family housing, for instance, right now is exempt. So there's no minimum percentage requirement. An elevator served building is required every single story unit in that building to be a type B. So you could argue that's 100%. but there's everything in between those poles.
Let me go to Brian, and then Rep Ortiz, I'm glad to see you. And since I didn't get to you at the top of the call, let me go to Brian and then I'll bring you in.
Sure. Yeah, I just want to make sure that I'm kind of hearing Paul. This almost sounds like kind of like inclusionary zoning-ish. Like, you know, you sort of you have you either build it or somehow the housing gets built. Is that kind of sorry, and I might have been misunderstanding you, but that's kind of what popped into my head as you were talking is,
Yeah,
you know, somehow this housing gets built. Whether you build it yourself or you
I think
pay.
that's a fair parallel
Okay.
because like what Denver says is you have to do X% of units affordable, or you can pay into a pool or do something else. I think it's just trying to be those or something else options.
Thank you both. Rep Ortiz.
Yeah, I'm sorry to be jumping in late, so if I'm misspeaking, let me know. Just want to kind of address some of the stuff I've heard across the nation. We don't have Colorado specific data, but across the nation, we have less than 1% of the most accessible unit, less than 5% of any type of accessible units. And Denver might have its own rules and regulations, but the way it's set up, according to federal ADA, is you have to meet a point system where it's very piecemeal on accessible features in a building. So you might not even get complete accessible units in some of those cases if the building meets accessible features. So just want to be very clear about kind of what the lay of the land is and understanding that lay of the land, what we are trying to do here.
Thank you for reminding us and giving us back grounded to that. With that in mind and the other conversation, particularly this latest that Paul and Brian were sharing, and a big note that this one requires some significant rewriting on my part. Brian, is your hand back up or does it remain up? Very good. Why don't I get to work rewriting that? I'm going to go to idea 6 in this section. And it currently reads from our last conversation, consider a report from CDU, DOLA and DOH, or others that elevates universal design principles, examines the cost delta of upfront cost for accessibility versus cost of repurposing or modifications. And I hope we're going to get some robust input on this, given Paul's earlier comments, particularly around what the heck do I mean when I'm talking about universal design principles. This idea, if you recall from our last conversation, was really wanting to highlight that it's easier to spend it up front and that we should be encouraging that and highlighting that fact. With the addition or with the exception of, I will go in, Paul, and add some of that same language we talked about on the earlier one to get a little more specific of what we mean here, talking about type A, type B, communication systems, and others. General thoughts after you've sat on this one that we talked about last month. Paul.
Maybe this might help make it more specific, but what if the report compares accessible housing options in Colorado versus either California, Illinois, or another state that has been identified as a gold standard or a higher standard of legislative requirement, and try to compare the differences that way?
I'm very open to that. I'd love to hear from the group on that, and I'd love to hear who wants to name the states that you feel are, whether they're the gold standard, or at least they're somewhere that we should strive to be. Paul, and then Tim.
I'll just say that California and Illinois were intentional.
Okay, thanks. Tim?
I didn't know that, but I was going to guess California, but That's probably easy. I'm just wondering, and maybe this is just, I think we get to the same place, but maybe it's just a matter of practicality or semantics here. But CEDU, I think, is fairly new. I know that DOLA and DOH are busy. I guess I'm just wondering if these are folks that are going to be able to do the analysis and do the report, or are we better served by saying that we consider asking CEDU or DOLA or DOH or somebody else to sponsor a report or an RFP for a report so that they can hire an organization that is equipped to do an analysis. I'm just not sure that those agencies are equipped to do the level of analysis that it sounds like you're looking for here.
So probably, but given the expertise needed to even do the procurement to bring that in, Tim, do you think that should be a sit at DOLA and they oversee the procurement for a contractor that could do that analysis?
They certainly could. I mean, they do a lot of RFPs, so they do a lot of they do a lot of procurement. So I would think that is something that they could handle. Yeah.
And we may, we had some conversations about the Kelsey who presented, and I know there were some thoughts that the Kelsey standards maybe weren't quite specific enough, but maybe we reach out to them and see if they have anything they've done since they're making that growth between California and Colorado. Shelley, your thoughts on this one?
Yep, and just to make, so we're saying consider a report from these that evaluates the universal design principles, examine the cost delta. What's not in here that should be factored is also the timing of because I think I've shared with you, Barrick and Carrie, California does have a gold standard, but the delay it creates for developers to be able to develop accessible units because of the different requirements for approvals, it can delay a development anywhere from 6 to 12 months, is what I've heard from our team out of California. So just important to evaluate both of them. Like, yes, we can get a report, we can look at the cost, and as we're evaluating the cost, we also need to be realistic about what does that do the actual development of construction.
Understood. I've added that and I will incorporate that into the language. Tim.
Yeah, this is Tim. And to Shelley's point, I think perhaps there's something after that that says, and then direct the agencies to come up with recommendations based on the report. So just so maybe that's not the right way to say it. Where I'm getting to is just so that the report doesn't get done for the sake of doing a report, but there's some that it's something that's going to be actionable.
Tim, you are speaking my language. I am a big objector to those that seem to go with the publish and pray strategy. We've got a really pretty report in a really thick binder on a shelf that nobody does anything with. So we'll make sure we direct agencies to make recommendations based on. Paul, your thought there?
Maybe instead of at that macro scale, bring it down to the micro. Have a report that says what it costs different from just a regular type B apartment unit to a fully accessible unit with a roll-in shower being one comparison, and the audio and visual elements. That's a very apples to apples. And then a harder one might be, I don't know, a 200. I'm trying to think of some, say a 10 acre or 20 acre parcel of land that doesn't have a requirement versus that same 10 acre parcel of land that has a requirement for X% of units of every type to have an elevator, etc. What I'm trying to capture is the cost delta for for that individual apartment unit isn't significant. The cost delta when you change land use and add more elevators and stuff, that's the one that I think industry fears might be more significant.
So let me take another run at Shelley. I'm sorry, your hand is up.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on a comment Paul made. I think it's important. We've thrown out some language, type A, type B, trauma-informed design, that we need to be consistent, whatever our recommendations are.
Yeah.
I'd be really interested when I think about trauma-informed, it is there's an element to that that focuses in on accessibility. And so this committee should really look at the consistency of language, because that can get confusing. And so for me, it'd be helpful to see type A, type B, trauma-informed, but what is that difference? And being clear on how we call that out to ensure that it is, I believe trauma-informed does address some of that accessibility when you look at the design, but is it meeting all the elements? And so type A and type B, we'll have to, there are obviously elements of that meet accessibility as well, but just for consistency purpose.
I appreciate that. And that highlights one of the things that I want to be clear that we're working on is it's one thing for us to even use this kind of language of trauma-informed universal design, type A, type B, when we're talking among an informed group. We're about to go to the general public, which may or may not be people familiar with some of this terminology. So we are figuring out whether we use kind of a glossary or if we use more plain language descriptions and then define these as these things. What I don't want to do is throw out to the public and expect them to make informed and educated feedback on terms that are a little inside the industry.
Are you saying we need a glossary, Barrick?
I think this entire task force does. I think certainly within housing, yes. Let me go to our final idea that was generated at the last one. Reads as follows: direct CHAFA, CEDU, or DOLA, and we'll come back and discuss if we want to keep naming all three of them, to examine the feasibility of a state role in promoting potential development of accessible units in need of investment from private or nonprofit sectors. And as you'll recall, there was two aspects of this conversation. One, some folks just said, is there a way to promote the fact that there is a development that is looking for investors or backing that could bring these units online? At the same time, some folks raised the question, is that the appropriate role of the state to be playing investor intermediary in promoting these, and can they do that? So I'll put to everybody the idea itself, and if we do like the idea, we'll let other folks figure out the legalities of or how the state would approach it. Do we like this idea, and do we want to name someone in particular that we think should be tasked with this, rather than leaving it as CHAFA, CEDU, or DOLA? Right.
I think just one thing, and this might just be technical in nature, that we need to look at is directing CHAFA to do anything is they're an authority, they're a quasi-governmental. So that's just a technical piece as I'm thinking about this in other ways.
I think it's more than a technical. I appreciate you flagging it, because we can't direct, and neither can the ledge. They can ask, plead, or the gov can do his thing. Shelley, and then Tim.
I think that's the role of the developer. I mean, they're working with investors on a regular basis to get their deals financed. And I agree with Brian. I don't think it's a role of CHAFA or the state to step in and try to promote investments from private or nonprofit sectors. I think investors look at the deal and the strength of the sponsor and so many other factors that's what drives an investor, but it's not going to be, you know, I know I wouldn't, yeah, as a developer, I wouldn't be looking to Chapa, DOLA or CEDO to source investments for us.
Fair enough. And Tim, I'm going to go to you and I'm going to open it up to the whole group. Is there anybody who wants to make the case that this idea should stay? But Tim, you had your hand up before I asked that question.
Yeah, and I'm going to echo what I've heard here. This is Tim. And I guess I most get hung up on the word promote. I don't think that any of these agents, well, I don't know about CETA, but I'm sure Chaff and Dola aren't going to want to be in a position of anything that seems like picking winners. So, or elevating one kind of asset class over another. But maybe there is a role in the governor's office. You know, there is a governor, you know, the governor's office does have housing, you know, aids, right? Housing aids. And so maybe it's about suggesting or considering or even directing, maybe not directing the governor, but asking that this be a issue that is also incorporated into the efforts that they take on.
And just so everyone's clear, I've had multiple conversations with Eleni, who has been leading for Gov on housing policy, and she is very interested in what comes out of this committee and this task force and how it can be incorporated into all of their efforts around housing and affordable housing. So if I'm hearing correctly, no one is an advocate of continuing the idea that the state should be the TechCrunch or VC info source for housing development. Is that correct? Okay. So we will strike this. I will drop some language that is more generally about encouraging the executive branch in their policy agenda to consider this throughout their efforts. Paul.
This might be too much of a tangent, but instead of kind of the investment side, maybe the state needs to develop an alternate safe harbor set of standards that developers and designers can use. So what I mean by that, like trauma-informed design, I've been looking on my other screen throughout the meeting, what standard is there? And there's statements that say like you shall be consider the acoustical privacy or something. What STC rating does that mean? It's maybe the state would take that and put it into that glossary, that very specific definition that we could use within the state and use with confidence that if we went that route, we wouldn't run afoul of any federal legislation, that it would be deemed a safe harbor and equal compliance, equal or better to those options. As you're typing, just like one little silly story with that. We designed tubs, the tub shower combo into accessible units over showers because the way the technical documents read, we have more options with a tub than we do a shower. And so there's little nuances in this that if there was a parallel set of standards that could sidestep some of those stupid things that have found their way into the federal rules.
This one's probably going to, this one and our earlier one around incentives is probably going to require the most rewriting from me. So rather than trying to do it real time on the call, I'm capturing some notes here. Paul, I may follow up with you on some of these, and I'll circulate back to everybody. That covers the ideas that we had. What I'm going to do is two things. One, I am going to get you out of here a little early today with an ask that in the 5 minutes after we hang up, you do something for me. I'm going to ask if you'll spend 5 minutes after we hang up to just jot down what ideas, concepts, or aspects of expanding the inventory of accessible housing and the funding mechanisms for it you don't feel like we had enough time to get to, and you want to see either an agency, CDO, or a continued work group continue to explore. What I don't want to do is two things. I don't want to try to jam ideas that we haven't had a chance to talk about into our stakeholder engagement that's starting here in a couple of days. But I also don't want to miss the opportunity for this group to name things in our report. So I would just ask that you spend a few minutes when we get off this call a little early to jot down any ideas you have for things that maybe we can visit in October as we get feedback, or things that you think can really move the needle on this. Otherwise, I want to again frame where we are with the stakeholder input. Because we've done some revisions today, I'm going to work quickly over the next 24, 36 hours to revise these, send them back out to all of you to make sure that I captured them accurately enough that you're comfortable sharing them with the public to get input on the ideas. Then we're going to, over this next week, be finalizing all of the 2-pagers for all of the committees to get these shared with about a 20-day window during which we're asking the public to provide that input. And I'm keeping it limited to that because what I want to do is be able to capture all of that stakeholder input, circulate it to all of you, and have you digest it a little bit before we get back on the phone for our October conversation. I'll again ask you to be thinking really hard about, are there outlets, whether they're social media, listservs, or your own networks that you can share these with. When we get all of these together, I will send you the hard copies, or not the hard copies, the digital copies in accessible formats of all of the 2-pagers. I'll also send you links to them online, and we'll provide some short links and a few graphics and QR codes for all of those. Otherwise, what I'd like to do, because although Representative David Ortiz is certainly not going anywhere, as of September 30th, he is closing his office as he wraps up his term as a state rep. So I want to make sure on each of these calls we have the opportunity. One, I want to thank Mr. Ortiz for his work on behalf of the community, on behalf of Coloradans. We are here because of his diligence in creating this task force and this work group. And I know he has been a passionate advocate. He has made my thinking and my facilitation stronger. And it's not just him, it's Elsa, his aide, it's his entire staff. So Rep Ortiz, while I get ready to wrap us a bit early, I want to give you the floor as you close your office, I know on the 30th, but are going nowhere away from Colorado in this work.
Yeah, Barrick, I want to start off by thanking you and Carrie for being tremendous partners in this. I mean, I think we've gone on this journey together. And, you know, without your amazing work, I don't think the subcommittees would have gotten to where they needed to be. And it's been really impressive to see. So I want to thank you both for all your hard work. I want to thank my staff, apart from representing my district, being able to work with and mentor a lot of these young adults. I know the older generation likes to dump on the younger generation, but maybe y'all just don't get the opportunity to work with some of the amazing young adults that I get to. So without my staff, we wouldn't have been able to be as effective in elevating these issues for disability rights and disabled folks. So I want to thank Elsa, Austin, Louisa, Sarah, and all the interns and Glado fellows that worked for me. And then also thank all of you. I mean, just hearing your discussions and the expertise and you know, the professional and lived experience that you bring to this work. And y'all know you're getting paid the big bucks to do this. So I just want to thank you all from the bottom of my heart for taking this seriously and for committing. And I'm excited to see what continues to come out of these groups. So thank you all very much.
I won't try to even match that. I'll just say thank you for the time today, and I will follow up by email. Take the time back today. I'm sure I'll ask you for some of it next month. Have a great week, everybody. Thank you.
Take care.